Since we now have our method to fetch users from Firebase, we can start working on our profile block. Inside of the screens directory, let's go into Profile, and then we're going to make the profile block by selecting Block, New Block, Profile. And then once that generates, we have our block folder where we have our profile block, profile event, and profile state. Before we create our profile state, let's take a look at what the screen is going to look like. Let's work our way from the top down. We have an app bar, and this app bar contains the username, and then we have a logout button on the right side. Here we have the profile image, the number of posts, the number of followers, and the number of following. We also have an edit profile button, and this button will change if you're viewing another user, because then you wouldn't be able to edit their profile. Instead, you would be able to follow or unfollow them. We have the username again, and then the bio. And then down here, we're displaying the posts in a grid or a list, if we tap on this tab over here. So by knowing what the screen will look like, we're able to define our state now. Let's go into our profile state, and we can remove the abstract and the profile initial. The first thing we need to keep track of in the screen is which user we're looking at. So that will be final user. Let's import models. And if we go into the user, we can see we get a lot of the information we need, such as the username, email, profile image, the number of followers, following, and the bio. So that's actually almost everything we need. Right now we're missing the number of posts, and the way we're going to get that is by keeping track of a list of posts. We also need to know whether the current view is a grid view or a list view. And then we also need to know if the user is currently following the selected user. As we didn't code up our post model yet to define each one of these posts, we're not going to be adding in some of this functionality yet. So for now, let's go back to our profile state, and we'll just make a final list posts, and we'll comment this out because we're going to be coming back to this later. We need to have a boolean to know if we're looking at ourselves, so is current user. We need a boolean to check if it's a grid view or a list view, a boolean for is following, and then we'll have a final profile status, which will be an enum, and this will define the current state of the screen. So let's go up here, and we'll make our enum profile status, and we'll have a few states. So initial, loading, loaded, and we can't forget error. Initial is the state for when the screen is first rendered. Loading is when we're fetching the user from Firebase. Loaded is when the user is fetched from Firebase and we can display the information. And then error means that there's a problem fetching the user from Firebase. And then finally, we need our failure. Let's write our constructor. These will be @required, this.user, import meta, @required this.isCurrentUser, this.isGridView, is following, status, and then failure. Props will be user, isCurrentUser, gridView, following, status, and failure. We should also generate our copy width. And now we have our copy width. And then the last thing we need is our factory constructor, which we'll put right underneath profile state. Factory profile state dot initial. And here we're just going to return default values. So the profile state, the user will be user.empty at first. Is current user is set to false initially. Is grid view will be true. Is following is false. The status is profile status dot initial. And then failure will be a failure. and this will be constant. And now we have all the information we need in order to create the screen, minus the posts. And we'll be adding in the posts once we add the functionality to create posts in the app. Let's go to our events. And for now, let's just focus on one event. This will be class profile load user extends profile event. This will take in a final string user ID, so we know which user to load. Let's write the constructor. And then props. User ID. Now inside of our block, let's first take care of the superconstructor. This should be profile state dot initial, and this is the factory constructor we just wrote. Now let's add the dependencies for our profile block. The first dependency is final user repository. And the reason we have a dependency on the user repository is so we can fetch information about the user. And next we need to have a dependency on the auth block. Auth block. And this is so we're able to compare the ID of the currently logged in user with the profile we're viewing. And if the IDs are a match, then we know that we're looking at ourselves. If the IDs are not matching, then we know we're looking at a different profile. Let's import blocks.dart. And the profile block will have @required user repository. And @required auth block. After the colon here, we can assign user repository equal to the passed in user repository, and the passed in auth block equal to the auth block. Now let's work on map event to state. The only event we wrote for now is the profile load user, and this event is going to fire when we want to load a user's profile. So inside this method, we need to check if the event is profile load user, and if it is, then we're going to yield asterisk a method called map profile load user to state, where we pass in the event. Let's write this method below. This will return a stream profile state and take in profile load user event. The method will also be asynchronous, and so that way we're able to yield a profile state. The first thing we need to do here is grab our user from Firebase, final user, await, user repository, dot get user with ID. And then we just pass in the user ID from our event. Once we have this user, we need to also check if the user is the current user. So we can write final is current user equals auth block dot state dot user dot uid, and check if the currently signed in user is equal to the user ID that we are loading. And now once we have this information, we can yield a new state with copy with, passing in the user is current user, and the status will be profile status dot loaded. Now there is a chance that this can error out, so we need to wrap this in a try catch block. And then we can catch the error and yield a state, copy with, the status is profile status dot error, and the failure will be a failure with the message, "We were unable to load this profile." One more thing we should add is to yield a state where we're loading. So the status will be profile status dot loading. And now when this event fires, it's going to go into the map event state, call map profile load user to state, pass in the event, which contains the user ID. We first yield a loading state, and that's when we show our circular progress indicator. Then we go into our try catch block, and here we get our user with the ID. If there's an error, then we would yield an error and show this to the user. If there's no error, we continue on, check if we're looking at the current user or a different user, and then yield an updated state with the user, the updated value for his current user, and set status to profile status.loaded. If we take another look at our profile state, you can see I left out some of these. So is grid view, is following, and posts. I didn't set that inside of this copy with yet, and that's because we're going to handle that later. In the next video, we're going to build out our profile screen.